Building a URL shortener is a sure and approachable way to flex your developer muscles. It has the right amount of challenge to keep you engaged, at the same time help you learn a few tricks that allows you to understand how building a full stack web app works. So in this video, I'm going to show you a few tools of a few of my favorite tools that I would use to build a URL shortener and actually build one. But before we do that, let's take a look at how a URL shortener works. And the first thing you would do is to provide a long URL to your user interface, which is then submitted to an API that is going to shorten this URL. Now, what this API does is to first of all receive the long URL, like I already mentioned, but then it will generate a random shortcode that you can then use as the short representation of that URL. And once it has generated this shortcode, you can then store both the long URL and the shortcode in your database. And that's how to shorten a URL. Then the next phase of a URL shortener is to lengthen an already shortened URL. Now, to lengthen the URL, we go to a domain slash the shortcode representation, which you can see from this diagram. And what happens basically is that our app is going to take the shortcode from that slug endpoint or from that dynamic endpoint, and is going to then send it to our lengthen API. And then that lengthen API is going to search in our database for that URL. So if it finds it, it's going to grab that URL and then grab its shortcode representation and then redirect the user to the long version of that URL. Now, this is the foundational architecture or system design of how a URL shortener works. Any other thing you see out there is a more elaborate architecture of this system, which can include things like authentication, user management, URL management, which means that you can do things like customizing the shortcode, using a custom name, deleting things you've stored previously, adding more things manually, and so on. But I wanted to keep this very simple so we can focus on just making sure we have an API, a database, and the UI, and make those round trips and just have some fun building out this project. So that's it. Let's jump right in and actually get started. Now, the first thing we need to do is to create a backend app, and we can do this in AWS using AWS Amplify. So go to your AWS console and search for AWS Amplify. When you find it, open it. And once it's open, click on the new app drop down and choose build an app. And let's give this app a name. Let's call it URL Shortener. I think I can add a 2 to it because I might already have an app called URL Shortener. And let's confirm deployment. And once the deployment is done, click the Launch Studio button, which is going to open Amplify Studio, where we can then start modeling our URL shortener. Now, the next thing we need to do is to actually create a data model to represent a URL. And to do that, from Amplify Studio, click Data from the sidebar and then click Add Model. Let's call this model URL, and then we can add a long URL field and a short code field. Once we've done all of this, we can click on the Save and Deploy button to kick off the deployment, and then we can confirm by clicking the Deploy button once more. Now, what's happening behind this scene, as you can see, is that Amplify is going to first of all set up our database, which is DynamoDB, and then it creates an API using AppSync from that database. So that means that this process is going to take a few minutes to complete. So let's wait for it to finish, and once it's done, we can move on to the next step. All right, now the deployment is done. But before we can actually go ahead and start consuming this API in our Next.js app, I want to do one more thing, which is to grab the credentials of this app from AppSync, or the API from AppSync, which is going to allow us to manually talk to this API when we want to. So to do that, head back to the Amplify console and search for AWS AppSync. Open it when you find it. And once it's open, find the app that you just deployed, which is URL Shortener 2 staging. Then go to settings, and you should see your GraphQL API endpoint key, as well as your GraphQL endpoint URL rather, as well as your API key. So you need to copy both of these credentials and store it in your clipboard. All right, so we have a data model, and we're able to grab the credentials that we can use to access this data or the content that is stored in this data model. Now, the next thing we need to do is to actually create a Next.js app and start talking to this API. So to do that, open your terminal, and instead of running a create next app, I'm going to use Digit to clone a repository I've created to make it easy for us to work on this project. So I've done things like setting up Tailwind and setting up some of the boilerplate code we're going to use for this project, so we don't have to spend a lot of time doing that. Now cd into this app and run npm install to install the dependencies. And once you've installed the dependencies, open the project in the code editor. And the next thing we need to do is to create an environmental variable file .env.local to store the credentials that we grabbed from AppSync. So I'm just going to paste the credentials here. Now we can open the code editor and run npm run dev to start this project locally. So if we head back to the browser and go to localhost 3000, we should see our app, and you can see that we already have some boilerplate UI and styles to make things easier for us to build out the rest of this app. And the first feature we need to add is to make sure that this URL text input is validated, just to ensure that whatever a user enters here, it's an actual valid URL. So if we head back to the code editor and open the home page, the first thing we need to do is to import the validator. And once we have this validator imported, we can create a state to track whether the input is validated or not, or whether the URL is valid or not. And once we've done this, we can update the class name for this input so that it reflects the state of this input or this input. And finally, we can then create an onKeyUp event, which is going to then check if the key that was pressed is the enter key. If it's the enter key, that means the user is attempting to submit this form. If the user is attempting to submit this form, then we'd like to check if the URL is valid first. If it is, then we can set the state to true. If not, we'll set it to false. So if you head back to the browser and enter an invalid URL, you can see we have a visual feedback that shows that this URL is invalid. Now that we're able to validate this URL, the next thing we need to do is try to shorten the URL. And to do this, we first of all need to create the shorten API. So go to pages/API and create a shorten.js file. And then we need to define or export a handler function. And inside this handler function, we can create a response object, which you can just quickly return for now. And it has a status code and data, which we'll define in a second. Now to create a shortcode, I've installed a library in this template called NanoID. And this is going to allow us to create a shortcode using the custom alphabet function. And this custom alphabet function can take a valid URL configuration, or basically we are saying that we want this function to only generate URL that can be, generate shortcodes that can be valid in a URL. And we want the length of that shortcode to be 5. So if I go ahead and log this shortcode to the console and open the code editor or the terminal and try to use a client to make a request to this API, in as much as it failed because there is no such thing as status code defined yet, we can see that the actual shortcode was logged to the console. All right, now that we have a shortcode, we can try to submit that shortcode along with the long URL to our database. So I'm just going to quickly close all of this out. And then the first thing we need to do is to configure or to grab our credentials. And once you have the credentials, we can go ahead and try to create first of all, create a try-catch block, and then we can make an API. We can make a fetch request to this endpoint. And once this request is successful, we want to set the response.data to the response. And we also need to set the status to 200. Now, if it's successful, but there's a GraphQL error from the API, we need to check for that error and change the status code back to 400. Now, any other error that happens, we can just set the status code to 400 and then update the data to the error message. Now, the next thing we need to do is to define this options object. And to do that, we just need to create an options variable. By the way, we can delete this log. And then we need to set the method for this request as post. And we also need to define the headers, which is going to set up the GraphQL API key that we need to access the endpoint. And then finally, we can set the body for this request, which is going to be made up of a GraphQL query, which I'll create in a second, as well as the variables as well. Now let's go ahead and create this query, which is going to be a GraphQL query. The GraphQL query is going to be a mutation, and that mutation is going to be called create URL, and it's going to accept a create URL input. And then finally, the query should return a long and short URL once it's done. And then let's set up the variables as well. The variable, just like we mentioned, is a create URL input type, and the input is going to be the long URL as well as the short code. Once we save this, we can open the test client and try to run this or try to test this API one more time. Once we've done this, we can run the send, we can click the send button. Since we have a long URL in the request body, we would get that long URL stored and also get a shortcode back. Now, another way to confirm that this mutation was successful is to head back to Amplify Studio and click on content. And you can see that the URL table has the actual value that we've just written to the database. Now that we can see that our API is working, the next thing we need to do is to hook the form we have in our UI to this API so we can submit the URL directly to this API, get the shorter version of the URL back to the UI, and then present that shorter URL. So to do this, we can head back to the code editor and open the home page. And the first thing we need to do is to create a state to track the URL. And once we've done this, we can create a function to submit this URL to our API. And inside this function, we can attempt to make a fetch request to this API. And in the options object, we can set the method to post. We can set the content type to JSON. And finally, we can set the body to the URL. And once we've done all of this, we can then get the response and finally log that to the console. And of course, we need to return the response as well, return the response back from this function. And once we've done this, now we need to actually use the submit URL. And to do that, we just need to go to the onKeyUp event. And since we've been able to check if the URL is valid, we can then try to call the submit function, pass the long URL. When we get the URL value back, we set it to the URL state. Now, what we can do with this URL state is first of all, check if it exists. We want to render the portion of the UI that shows the shortcode. So if the short URL, if the response exists, we need to show that shortcode as an option that the user can then click to go to that shortcode, which in turn, as we'll see later, will direct the user back to the long URL. So once we've done that, we can replace this text with the actual long URL. We can also replace this one with the short URL and also make sure the link points to the long URL, or the short URL rather. So if we go back to the browser and go back to our localhost URL and try to submit the URL, if I hit enter, you can see that we get a shorter version of this URL. But then the problem is that if I click on this shorter version of the URL, I get a 404 because we're yet to create this this dynamic endpoint that is going to lengthen the URL, which takes us to the second stage of our URL shortener. Now, to lengthen the URL, as you saw from the diagram on how to shorten or how to lengthen the URL, or how a URL shortener works rather, what we need to do is to create a dynamic route or a dynamic endpoint that is going to grab the shortcode, and then that endpoint would use an API, or in this case, since it's Next, use a get server side props to make a request to the endpoint or to our API, and then grab the long URL and redirect to that long URL. That's just a summary of what we're going to do. So let's just go and actually do that. So head back to the code editor and let's create a short.js endpoint, which is going to be a dynamic page. And inside this page, we're going to first of all just create an empty component. So we're going to import React, then create a component that renders nothing, and then export that component. But what's important is that we also export a get server side props, which is going to use the parameter we receive on this page to then make a request to our API. Since get server side props requires or demands that you return an object, let's return one that just for now just redirects back to the home page. And this should fix the 404 error we're getting when we try to visit a dynamic endpoint. So if I hit enter and click on the short version of the URL, it's just going to take us back to the home page. All right, now let's use this parameter to get our long URL. So if we head back to the code editor, we need to grab our credentials, which includes grabbing the endpoint as well as the key. Now, once we've done this, we can then attempt a fetch request, which takes an option that we're going to define in a second. And if it's successful, we grab the response, and then we grab the URL from the response, and then replace redirecting to that URL instead. Now, once we've done this, let's quickly go ahead and create these options. So first of all, we need to set the method to post, and we need to set the headers so that we also set up the GraphQL API key. And then finally, we need to create the body and set it to a query and the variables which we need to create next. Now the query, just like we saw in the API, is going to be a GraphQL query. And this GraphQL query is going to be a list URLs query. And inside this list URL queries, which is going to take a model URL filter input, we're going to list our URLs. Now, what we need to do next is to actually define this filter input as variable, which is going to help us filter everything we'll have from the list down to just the item that matches the shortcode. So let's create a variable that checks if the shortcode matches the shortcode from the parameters. Now, once we've done this and head back to our browser and click the shortcode, we would get redirected to the actual website that shortcode represents. Cool. And the next thing we need to do is to head back to Amplify console and actually try to deploy this app that we've created. So if we head back to the AWS console and go back to Amplify, then choose the URL shortener we've just created, then switch from the backend environment to a hosting environment. Now we need to host from GitHub, and to do this, we need to push this project to GitHub. So head back to the code editor. Now click the publish button and click publish to GitHub private repository. Once this is done, go back to Amplify console, select GitHub, click connect branch. select the repository, leave the branch as main, and click Next. Now scroll down to the advanced settings so we can provide our credentials. Let's set the GraphQL endpoint as well as the GraphQL key. And finally, we need to explicitly tell AWS Amplify to grab these credentials and put them in a .env.production file for this build. So to do that, add this command, which basically grabs, first of all, prints the environmental variable to the terminal, then it grabs the endpoint and the key and dumps it into the .env.production file using grep. Once it's done, we can close the window and click Next. Then finally, we can click Save and Deploy to kick off the deployment. Now the deployment is going to take a few minutes. So what we're going to do is that we're going to wait for it to finish, and once it's done, we can then come back and take a look at the production URL and make sure that our app works just like it did on our local machine. Alright, so the deployment is done, and we can click on the production URL to take a look at what the app looks like. So if you paste a URL, a long URL, and hit enter, it looks like everything works as expected. So if we click on this URL, we get redirected to the long version of the URL. Alright, that's it for this video, and I hope you enjoyed watching. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments and I'd be glad to attend to them. That said, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.